recording from the Safe Sport Law to your organizational policies preventing sexual abuse in adaptive sports. And again, I'm with Prevent Connect, and this web conference is also being held in partnership with Reliance. And so with that, I want to introduce you all to our facilitator today, my colleague, Reliance's project coordinator, Brian Pinero. Hey, Brian, how are you doing today? And Brian, if you're there, you might be on mute because I can't hear you. Okay, we're going to work on getting Brian on the call. But give us a minute. Sorry about this. Brian, once you're there, you go ahead and just let me know because I really want you all to hear from Brian a little bit about Reliance.
Brian is typing into the chat.
Brian, are you on the phone with us? We can't hear you, Brian, so I do see you that you're in the chat, but we're not hearing you. So if you would go ahead and give us a call on the phone line and let me know when you're there, that would be great. Feel free to interrupt me. But as I was saying, Reliance is really a partnership between several national organizations. Brian, is that you? Not yet. Okay. So Prevent Connect and CalCASA is one of those organizations. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence are the two other partners in Reliance. And so one of the things that Reliance has been doing is really looking at how sport, hey Brian, you want to take it from here? Was I doing a good job explaining Reliance?
You did a great job. I don't know what happened there, but I'm here now, so let's go ahead and get going so we can make sure that we get to some great presenters that we have here today. Ashley, thank you for helping me as I got to my technical difficulty.
No problem.
Hello, everybody. This is Brian Pinero, and I am with Reliance, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Reliance here in a second. We are located here in Washington, D.C., where I am taking this webcast today. It is a beautiful, I think it's 65 degrees, so I'm really down that I have to be inside when we've had such a rough winter, but really excited to be with all of you, so ready to get this started. I want to first of all say that having you all here is really, I think, an important part to, for us to really being a part of the solution to ending sexual violence. And one of the things that Reliance that we believe is that we can do this together in one generation. Reliance came together bringing three organizations with over 70 years of collective experience with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Prevent Connect. And our three organizations came together with seed funding from the NFL to look at a bold way to try to address sexual violence. Our work has been a part of trying to create and expand research in the area, working in policy, both here in Washington, D.C., and also assisting other state policymakers. Innovative programs, like I'll talk in a little bit about our sports programming center that we have, but also working both in the nonprofit and the private sector. We have reached out to organizations in the nonprofit world who are trying to do innovative work. We have a grants program that we have funded organizations to try to create new programming and help it succeed, but also recording those grants that we've had to make sure that along the way, how did organizations accomplish their goals? What are some of the lessons that can be learned from it? We've also worked with private sector, working to create better workplaces. So we work with leaders, we work with companies, we work with organizations, we also work with their workforce to try to make sure that we are addressing not just sexual violence, but also sexual harassment. And as you can see some of our partners over here to the side, we are constantly expanding the partners that we have, and we will continue going forward to reach out with anyone who is trying to make a difference in stopping sexual violence. So one of the things that we put together in our program was the Sports and Prevention Center. And if you go to Reliance, our website, you can actually go and if you click about one of our solutions, you'll be able to see and get to this page here. We believe that sport is part of the solution. And one of the reasons that we believe that is that many of the things that are within sport, the values, teamwork, accountability. These are all the things that help create the kind of environment and the culture when you're trying to prevent sexual violence. And for us, this is a matter of trying to collect information that is already out there in the sports world, but also try to bring together information so that other people in the sports area can learn about it. So as you can see here, we've got 4 different things of the solutions. We have resources, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We also have research that we are collecting. We have several papers that we have put out, including a literature review about what is out there around violence prevention and sexual violence in sport, and as well as bringing together researchers who are also doing work out there and trying to find ways to expand their research and partner to be able to get that out to the field. We also have a roadmap, which is basically our theory of change, that talks about how do we work with sports organizations, teams, coaches, policy, and athletic directors as well as organizations to try to help them develop prevention in their sport and their organizations. And then also, as you can see at the bottom, the learning exchange, where we will post exactly something like this, a webinar in which we've had expertise, and then post it for people to be able to go and see. We've had a few other webinars on there, as well as blogs and information and things that are happening out there in the sports world that are doing things that are directly associated with preventing sexual violence. As I talked a little bit before, that we have collected resources and something that we identified that we really wanted to try to put out there. There are many programs that are doing things in the sports world to prevent sexual violence, and are also, whether it's creating policies, awareness, engaging coaches, engaging athletes. We put together a place where you can put all of that information. We have over 100 resources. So if you go there, you can find information that we've collected and that we're constantly curating and adding to this. Whether it's you want to try to figure out a way to create a policy in your league or your organization, if you are a coach and you are trying to find a way to create something to get your players engaged, we've got all that in our resource database. And so also, if you would like to add yourself to our database, please, we also can add you to it. If you're doing good work around this, we want to capture it. So you can also go to our website and submit a request to be added to the database. So we believe that sport is part of the solution, and that's why that we are here today to lead this webinar and host it and bring together these great people. And so one of the things that we kind of wanted to talk about, just to kind of start this off, was just a really quick question, and just kind of ask, like, what does athlete safety mean to everyone? So if you have a thought about that, please submit it over here to the side on the chat button, on the chat window. We'd love to hear what you think. Give everybody a second to see if anybody can go first.
Yeah, it's this thing where when you ask a question, we have to give people a chance to think before they respond. So it looks like folks are typing in the chat right now. So we'll see what comes up. Because I mean, that's kind of a broad question, right? What does athlete safety mean to you? I think we're probably going to get a lot of similarities, but there are also maybe some variants depending on, you know, where people are working, what athletes you're working with. But Brian, I see Kenna says to make sure they're safe and respected in all aspects, mind, body, and spirit. I really like that. It's like such a nice holistic look at safety. Lizzie says comfortable. Julianne, safety is essential. It's the foundation of the athlete's experience and ultimately their success. Jeff says the opportunity to develop emotional and physical attributes that promote healthy community norms. So I like that. Another example of not just looking at like a physical safety, but also folks being emotionally safe, the well-being of the whole athlete again. So I love this theme of you know, looking at safety from this holistic viewpoint. Jessica says athlete safety means their space, so locker room, on the field, practice, is safe from abuse, violence, and harassment from coaches, teammates, rivals. Victoria says athletes holding each other accountable, making sure they're supporting each other emotionally. Catherine, protection and training from coaches on consent and physical touch. It also means safety for athletes when working individually with coaches. And then Joe says all leaders know that safety is part of their job. So Brian, any thoughts about what's coming up?
No, I love all of it. I think it is something I think when we think about safety of athletes, we need to think about in a lot of different ways, and that includes different groups. That includes how do we continue to evolve it as we go along. And safety is something that you always have to check in on so things change as time goes along. Cool. This is great. And this is really what we want here, is to have the opportunity to have people engage, and we'll have a few more questions as we go along here. You have people participate and capture what you're saying, and also we will, as we go along, we know there will be questions that will come up that will not necessarily be prompted by us, and we will be working to collect those as well. Well, let's go ahead and get started and introduce you to the great group that we have here today. We're so lucky to have 3 people that are going to do a great job presenting and have some great information for us. We're going to start today with Meg Stone, Director of Impact and Impactability Triangle. We also have Katie Hammond, Director of Education, U.S. Center for Safe Sports, and Joe Walsh will also be here, President and Director of Adaptive Sports New England. And so we are really excited to have the 3 of them. I'll go a little bit more into depth on each one as we introduce them, and I'll tell you a little bit about their bio. So to start with, we're going to go ahead and have Meg Stone, who is the Executive Director, as I said, of Impact Boston, an abuse prevention and empowerment self-defense program that is part of the Disability Service and Advocacy Organization Triangle. Meg has led a team of adaptive sports athletes and abuse prevention educators to create the ASAP, which is the Adaptive Sports Abuse Prevention Curriculum, which is designed to educate coaches and volunteers of adaptive sports organizations on how to recognize and prevent sexual abuse. Meg has led sexual abuse prevention planning programs in schools, disability service agencies throughout Massachusetts. And so she is going to start us off, and Meg, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yay. The most challenging part of this webinar was the technology, so I'm very excited that you can hear me. So I'm going to start actually with a story that a colleague of mine who is a martial artist and martial arts instructor told me. And when she told me this particular story, it made me even more committed to making sure that we have a way of working to prevent sexual abuse that is really relevant to sports. This colleague of mine was teaching a martial arts summer program as part of a large youth-serving organization, and she went to the required sexual abuse prevention training and listened through the training, and she asked a couple of questions about how to implement the specific messages that the trainers were giving, and the response that she got from the trainers was, well, just don't touch the kids. And she thought about that for a while and realized that there was no way that she could possibly teach physically active martial arts, wrestling, grappling, any of the other skills that she was looking to make sure that the kids learned without any physical contact. And the reason that I start in that place is because folks who are not only working in athletics, but working in athletics with people with a variety of mobility needs and challenges and other needs are going to be in a situation where very prescriptive rules about touch may not be relevant and may not be possible. So it is very important to me in my work with organizations around preventing sexual abuse to be able to develop abuse prevention strategies that really highlight and uplift what is best about the work rather than working against what's best about the work. So the reality is we have this webinar and we're doing this work because there are so many news headlines about sexual abuse in sports. And every sports practitioner that I've ever met has been extraordinarily committed to ensuring that athletes are safe and that sexual abuse is prevented in their organization. But often the biggest challenge is knowing what to do, what to look for, and where to begin. And for me, one of the most important ways that I approach the work is a result of a very big misstep and a very big missed opportunity on my part. And I always like to start presentations talking about it because everything I learned from this misstep has really informed my work for the last almost 10 years. So I was in a situation almost 10 years ago where I was leading a brand new abuse prevention program at a disability service agency. It was an organization where people were a little bit skeptical, a little bit uncomfortable with the work that we were doing. We were working very hard to kind of build support among some of the key leaders and some of the most influential staff members in the organization. Our brand new program coordinator started work, and on one of her first days, she was making the rounds, trying to shadow some of the other programs to learn more about them, and she observed a situation in which a very popular staff member asked a woman with an intellectual disability to scratch his back, and then jokingly offered her $1 to scratch his back. And I would like to say that I reported it immediately and we intervened, but the reality was that that did not happen. We really struggled with it, and I'm very sorry to say that we ultimately decided not to report. And as not proud of that decision as I am, everything that I learned from why I didn't report has really driven home for me how challenging it is to create an organization where people truly feel empowered to speak up about abuse. So some of the reasons that we didn't report were that we feared challenging a popular staff person, that it would cause all of the rest of our work and the entire focus on abuse prevention to lose support. We also feared that nobody would consider the behavior a problem. It was a time and a place where there was not as much awareness as there is today. And I think when people were thinking about abuse, they were thinking about the very overt acts of abuse that were specifically designed by the law as being reportable, and were not connecting those overtly abusive actions with other types of behaviors. There were no policies prohibiting the behavior, and there were no clear policies that protected reporters. So what we learned from that experience is that training is important, but usually training alone is not enough to make people feel safe speaking up. We had done a mandatory training for everybody in the organization in which we had talked about things like safe touch and choice and body autonomy, and the individual that I spoke about in the story had taken that training. The other thing we realized is speaking up is scary for anyone. I was an abuse prevention professional and a manager, and I still felt scared. I can't imagine how much more scared somebody who is not as knowledgeable about the issue or who is not in a management position would have been. Also, we realized that we couldn't just focus on the most overt or egregious acts of abuse, that we needed to have ways of systematically addressing smaller line-crossing situations that may be indications of bigger problems, and that we really needed the visible support of leaders, because otherwise we were not going to be able to get the support that we needed to do the right thing. So from this experience and many others, we began working on organizational prevention strategies. So the different actions that an organization can take to proactively prevent sexual abuse of anybody who gets supports and services. And the 4 elements that we identified were organizational culture, policies, staff training, and in this case, athlete training. And what's important about organizational prevention is that there is no one magical action that can prevent sexual abuse all on its own. And each of these elements have a specific role and a specific limitation. So organizational culture, the strength of focusing on organizational culture is that it's really the unwritten rules that everyone follows no matter whether they know they're following them or not. So it may have the strongest influence on the way people act and what people do and don't do in the organization. Its limitations are that it's very difficult to measure or define, and the amount of work that it has taken several organizations to define their culture has really shown me that it is both one of the most defining characteristics of an organization and one of the most difficult to pin official policies, the biggest strength that a policy has is that it's very clear, it gives people recourse, and it is basically the official communication of the organization about what it expects, what it values, what it allows, and what it does not allow. Its limitations are that policies can't be effective if they're not widely known or followed, or if they're just generic and they don't fit the specific organization. Staff training is really valuable in terms of helping people develop the specific knowledge, skills, and awareness to be able to intervene in certain types of situations in certain consistent ways. It can also unify people around a philosophical approach. A limitation is that it often won't change behavior if it's brief and if it's not connected to organizational culture. Also, if the trainer's message is different than the message that people get every day from their supervisors, it's going to be very hard for people to heed a person who they will never see again. Prevention skills for athletes, teaching athletes to recognize unsafe situations, to protect and advocate for themselves, to report questionable or problematic interactions. The biggest strength is that a lot of abuse is perpetrated when an athlete is alone and by a person that they thought they could trust. So having a skill that the athlete can employ at any moment is a really key part of a prevention strategy. Its limitation is that it can send a very mixed and very problematic message to teach athletes to advocate for themselves, to teach athletes that their body is theirs, and then if no other work is done within the organization, it could be possible that they're getting the opposite of that message in practice from the people that are surrounding them. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of these components of prevention. I'll spend the most time on culture and policies. Some of the other areas will be addressed in other ways. So when we think about organizational culture, there's a definition that I find particularly helpful, and I'm just going to read it. The values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization. Organizational culture includes an organization's expectations, experiences, philosophies, and values that hold it together and is expressed in its self-image, inner workings, interactions with the outside world, and future expectations. It's based on shared attitudes, beliefs, customs, and written and unwritten rules that have been developed over time and considered valid. The organizational culture is each person's understanding of how the organization functions and what is and is not an acceptable way to interact within the organization. And it's something that oftentimes we feel before we can articulate. But it does really have a key role to play in prevention of abuse. So as I thought about organizational culture related to abuse prevention, one of the things that I thought a lot about was, what is the culture of an abusive family system or an abusive organization? The more deeply we thought about the dynamic of sexual and other types of abuse, the more clearly we saw the types of organizational cultures that we wanted to build. So just thinking about what an abusive situation is, it can be tempting to think of sort of specific overt acts as being the definition of abuse, but often it is dynamic power inequities and interactions that can define abuse. So in an abusive situation, there's a big power imbalance. One person has a lot of power while others have little or none. So in an abuse prevention organization, we're looking at shared power, accountable leadership. Also in an abusive situation, a person in power erodes people's trust gradually by violating people's bodies and boundaries and just experiences themselves as being entitled to do so. So in an abuse prevention organization, official policies and expectations give staff the tools to question and challenge more subtle violations, and we'll talk about that later, some in policies. In an abusive situation, touch is chosen by the person in power with no regard for anyone else's wishes or needs. In an abuse prevention organization, people with disabilities get choice about how they're touched, and staff are also respected. Staff also get choice about the types of touch that they experience. Person with power in an abusive situation goes unchallenged because other people are afraid and the cost of challenging someone is too high. In an abuse prevention organization, people get the skills to be able to challenge abuses of power and boundary violations so that people can speak up and advocate for themselves and others in line crossing situations. So overall, we're looking to create teams that are trusting and cohesive enough to grapple with the complexities of sexual abuse, but not so loyal that it becomes impossible to act when someone they previously trusted violates a student or an athlete's boundaries. Some of the organizational culture characteristics that we have seen in organizations that are focusing a lot of energy on preventing sexual abuse is that communication about difficult or challenging issues is supported and welcomed, as is constructive challenge. Constructive challenge is very hard, and it's something that really has to be built into an organizational culture. There's a lot of support for people holding the emotional weight and the reality of abuse. People communicate and address situations when boundaries are violated, and people have the space to think critically about what consent looks like, how and why athletes are touched, what happened, how entitled does someone feel to refuse unwanted touch or unwanted attention, even if it has no ill intent. So if anybody wants to think about this, the next piece of this webinar is going to talk about official policies. So in shifting our focus from culture to policies, I'm just going to ask folks to just put in the text chat ways that you guys have implemented organizational policies. And as folks are doing that, I will continue on, and if there are things that come from the text chat, we'll address them. Policies are a very important way that an organization can create an environment where athletes are safe or where there is recourse in a situation where somebody compromises the safety of an athlete. So thinking about effective policies, there's some key elements that I like to see when I'm looking at a policy. The first is that it's widely relevant. It's not just about one incident that we want to make sure never happens again. It's something that applies to a large majority of the work that we do. Also, it's clear and specific. Somebody can read it, a new volunteer, a person who's only working with you for a summer camp program, person who has a limited role with your organization but is still interacting directly with athletes can read it once and know what it's talking about. That it's enforced and enforceable, both with the resources of the organization and the political will to follow it, especially if following it means intervening to prevent a very popular or very revered person from violating a boundary or crossing a line. Also, it's consistent with the skills and training. The people charged with enforcing the policy have to have either the training or the skills or the capacity to be able to do what the policy says they're going to do. Policies are not magic. One of the important things they can do is they can communicate an organization's values and expectations. They can enable us to address risky and problematic actions before they escalate. The organization that I described at the beginning of my presentation now has a policy that would give me recourse to address the situation that I saw. At the time, I did not have any recourse. They can also create clarity and consistency under stress. Policies can't do everything. They can't solve an organizational culture problem. There are many organizations that have beautiful things on paper that do not match up to what the actual reality is of life in that organization. And they can't be meaningful if the people that are in charge of enforcing them do not have the skills or the power to do so. We saw a classic example of this in a group that I was working with, actually a theater organization, where a human resources director was charged with intervening by a policy. It was her charge, it was her role to intervene, but she was stopped from intervening when the person who was acting inappropriately was a famous actor who drove ticket sales. So policies only work if we're willing to apply them to the most powerful people in our organization. So the next thing I'm going to do is talk a bit about different types of policies or different areas that your organization may want to think about covering with policies. And I'll just talk about some elements of those policies that make them effective. An abuse reporting protocol. Important elements of this is it gives you clarity about both your legal obligations and your organizational responsibilities in terms of what you have to report, to whom, and who else in the organization you have to tell. One key element of this protocol is that it's easily accessible. In the organization that I'm part of, our abuse prevention protocol is laminated and hung up on several bulletin boards and several other places. So if a person receives an abuse report, they can grab the policy and it's right there for them. Another important thing to think about in policies is whistleblower protections. Something in writing that gives employees who report suspected abuse the same protections as they would have if they were reporting suspected financial impropriety. Something that explicitly protects people from retaliation and that sends a message that really discourages a culture of secrecy. Another important thing, especially in a sport organization or an organization in which there is physicality or touch, is a policy that communicates expectations about touch. I worked with a network of schools that are for students with significant disabilities, and a very active team spent several months writing what is now their touch policy, and that policy is available with the handouts for this webinar. It gives people clarity about types of touch that are and are not acceptable. It really balances all of the individualization that is the best of adaptive sports with giving people clear recourse when they see a concerning behavior. It can create unified expectations, clarity, and if people are new, they are not following inconsistent models because people are acting in a consistent way. Another aspect of policies is a code of ethics or a code of conduct, which really communicates positive expectations, defines clear boundaries, and again, we don't have to wait until a situation escalates to overt sexual abuse if we have a code of ethics or a code of conduct that outlines ethical touch and interactions and unethical touch and interactions. That way, a lot of the news stories that we read about sexual abuse in sport, there are usually precursors to overt acts of sexual abuse, some of which could be addressed with a code of ethics that clearly defines what is not okay in terms of relationships between staff and athletes. So I just have this. This is an example of an abuse prevention policy put out by an insurance company. It's pretty generic. It says some things about prohibiting sexual abuse, but it's ultimately very challenging to understand and enforce. So one of the things that we strive to do with the organizations that we collaborate with is to create policies that are reflective of the realities of the work and the organization's mission and goals and purpose. So this is Team Collaborative. They're an educational collaborative that we worked with to develop an abuse prevention plan. And in their touch policy, it really states the purpose and the values. Anytime a staff member is touching a student, the touch must be intended to serve the student. And then it outlines specific recognized reasons for touch and goes into detail about what those types of touch look like. No touch policies make things very simple and very clear, and some organizations can live with them. A lot of athletic organizations and or organizations that work with people with disabilities cannot realistically have a no-touch policy. So I'm just going to very briefly address staff training. This is a training that we're actually going to be rolling out at the Adaptive Sport Conference in November, put on in Phoenix. And this is a curriculum for coaches and volunteers and staff of adaptive sports organizations designed to help them really reflect on what unsafe or potentially unsafe or boundary crossing situations look like, how to speak up, how to understand trauma, and how to report abusive situations. One of the activities that we present is called Inbounds, Out of Bounds, Review the Tape, and it's an opportunity for discussion about certain questionable, potentially problematic interactions, and really look at whether the organization finds them to be acceptable, not acceptable, types of touch or types of comments like, you're getting so strong, the ladies better watch out. Is that inbounds, out of bounds, or review the tape? Also, squeeze that is intended to help a person with autism deal with sensory needs. Is that inbounds, out of bounds, or do we have to review the tape? And as the group address and discuss these issues, clarity about values and norms in terms of preventing abuse can rise up. So in summary, I realized that the majority of the people on this webinar are leaders or staff of adaptive sports organizations. And I'm not asking you to change your mission to abuse prevention, because you exist to proliferate athletics and athletics for people with disabilities. So what we're really aiming for is identifying abuse prevention strategies and practices that further the rest of your mission. So if you're devoting your time to abuse prevention, what we want to do is do it in such a way that furthers the rest of your excellent work. So introducing constructive challenge, critical thinking, clear communication, accountability, and teamwork, and transparency is not just about preventing sexual abuse. It's about having those tough conversations about how to make the best possible program that you can, how to challenge athletes, how to support athletes, and how to create a safe environment for everyone. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian, who will introduce the next presenter.
And thank you so much, Meg. And Brian, just before you move on to Joe, I noticed that the last text chat question we asked around how can you or have you created strong policies to protect athlete safety, we only had one response. So thanks, Jeff, for responding and talking about hiring practices. But I'm just wondering for the rest of you, is that maybe question didn't resonate, or I don't know if you've encountered some challenges with that. So if there's any thoughts around that question, please feel free to let us know. I was curious because I only saw that one response come up. So anyways, there you go, Brian. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. All right, we're going to move on to our next speaker, and that's going to be Joe Walsh. Joe is going to talk a little bit about an actual policy implementation that he did, so he'll walk through that with us. Just introducing Joe, he's the founder and president of Adaptive Sports New England in Boston. He has previously served as the managing director of the Paralympics for the U.S. Olympic Committee, and he coached U.S. cross-country skiing for 13 years. Joe is actually a two-time Paralympian in cross-country skiing and former world champion. Cool. And he has also served on boards of directors for Adaptive Sports USA, the International Blind Sports Federation, the United States Olympic Committee, U.S. Ski and Snowboarder Association, and the New England Nordic Ski Association. So we are really excited to have Joe here. And Joe, we are, I think, actually having your piece about how you implemented it will be very exciting for all of our attendees to do. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Excuse me. I've got the easy part on here because all of the real work that we've done is already written down and in the policy, which you all have access to through the handouts for this webinar. So the bulk of my work or bulk of my presentation is just captured in that. Those of you who know me know that I have a visual impairment. I'm legally blind, so I won't be reading that because that would take us all day. But I encourage you to pick that up and grab it, and either while I'm talking or as we move past this and take it home. And I've provided that in Microsoft Word format precisely so that you can steal from it, borrow it, use it, take whatever you need from that or whatever you would like from that. And we'll go through that in just a second. So as Meg had indicated, there are a couple of things that we want to do with a policy. What we've done is a very global, very limited policy that is intended to be global and simple so that we can meet our obligations for being a Paralympic sport club recognized by the U.S. Olympic Committee and meet our obligations to our participants and members that work with our organization, whether they be athletes or staff or volunteers, families, all of our constituents. So I'm also not seeing the slides that you're seeing, so I'll ask Tori to put us on the objective slide, and we really are trying to accomplish a couple of things with our policy. One is, as Meg indicated, establishing a statement of our organizational values and culture. And one of them is that we are a sports organization. We're not a sexual abuse organization. So we're trying to make sure that we capture athlete safety elements here, but also keep it focused so that all of those athlete safety elements can be addressed straightforwardly. We want to identify who's responsible for what, where, when to report, and how to report. Who needs this? This is for our staff and volunteers need to have go through certain sections of this. It's focused on them, but it's really focused on the organization as a whole. And then the final objective is to make sure that our policy is focused and is creating the outcomes that we want, and that we put all the excess baggage, the information around some of the how to implement that in appendices. So we switch to the slide that says policy. You'll see that our policy includes 5 different sections. It actually has a 6th section that says other items, but the 5 core sections: background checks, education and training, prohibited contact, conduct, reporting, and report review. So in keeping with our organizational culture focus, we want to focus on the first 2 items up there, making sure that all athletes and all coaches and staff, volunteers who have any kind of frequent contact with or unsupervised contact with participants, program participants, that they all have background checks and that they all undergo at least baseline education and training. And that starts with the training that is available through the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. That's our core piece of training that we use. The levels of the types of conduct that are prohibited under our policy are spelled out there. The reporting requirements are then spelled out, when and how to report, and then the process for what to do once that report is filed. How we as an organization respond to a report is spelled out in our Appendix B. So there's our Appendix A and B. Our Appendix A is the list of prohibited conduct. Appendix B goes through the reporting review process. Reports need to be in writing. They're handled by an ethics officer, and we're a very small organization, as I know many of your organizations are. So we're very we created this position of an ethics officer from one of our board members has the background and has volunteered to be the ethics officer. And that's separate from the organizational leadership, in case that the organizational leadership should be the one to whom the complaint is focused on, or the report is focused on. So we want to make sure that there's a free and clear step for individuals to take should they feel compelled to report some prohibited conduct. Sorry, I keep getting that one wrong. And we focus then on informal resolution of the incident. If we can resolve this to the satisfaction of the parties, that's what we want to do. And if not, then the ethics officer, there's a process by which the ethics officer implements with investigation and then forwarding a formal report to the president and the board of directors. And as the organizational leadership, the board of directors has the authority to create sanctions and take action as necessary. As we developed our policy, and I know that this is probably the scariest part is, well, where do I start? We had that same question. We were privileged enough to have the right people in our organization. We've got a legal counsel who specializes in abuse cases. So he has expertise in there. So he, along with the board member who ended up being our ethics officer, plus one of our senior staff, worked on development of the policy. But they started off by looking at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport principles and what we're trying to accomplish. Looking at national organizations and the requirements. I'll tell you that we went to the Paralympic Sport Club websites and resource pages and whatever, looking for direct guidance, and didn't find any. But we still understood what their overall principles were, and so we tried to shape the policy there. The policy that we ended up with did start with somebody else's, and I think it was the U.S. Association of Blind Athletes that we started with theirs as a baseline, and then built ours around that. You at this point, you should be able to check a variety of different peer organization policies, including the one that we're sharing with you. And as I said, I think that the U.S. Association of Blind Athletes has one as well that we found to be a useful base. And then after you sort of have a picture of what other people are doing, have a discussion about your own priorities, and identify what your most important elements are and how long, how short. One of the things that we prioritized was keeping our policy short and readable. So we kept the policy itself to 2 pages and then added in the 2 appendices after that, keeping the focus on our desired outcomes. And then finally, once you've got that drafted, you really want, or as part of the drafting policy, you really want to make sure that your legal counsel and your board of directors and other external parties who you trust get a look at it because you want it to be a useful element. Our policy lives on our website as well as in our core documents, and it is an active document that we're ready to adopt and adjust and edit as necessary. It's a living document, but it has a permanent place as it gets updated. Has a permanent place on our website in our About Us section, so that it should be easily findable by anyone visiting our website. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm going to turn it back over to the group, and I'm open for questions through the chat system as necessary. Brian?
Thanks, Joe. We do have a question that we kind of wanted to ask after that. And as you talked about some of the people that you had involved, I think a good question to ask the group is, can you all give us some examples of people that you would need involved or have involved when developing policies in your organization? Who are some? Is it just board members? Is there specific staff? Do you have a legal counsel that you work with directly that you want to bring in? So just some ideas of people that you think in the organization that you should connect with when you're trying to develop your policy. Let's see here.
So we can give folks a few minutes to answer, Brian, and then circle back.
Yeah.
So if you want to move on to Katie, and then we'll, sorry.
I do, and one thing I did, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted because it's just great seeing that people connect, that we're seeing connecting going on in the chat, and that's exactly what we want, so got a little distracted there. We are lucky enough to have Katie Hanna, who's going to be here, and she is going to, in a second, talk to us a little bit about the Safe Sport law. And just to introduce Katie, so she is the Director of Education and Outreach for the United States Center of Safe Sport. Katie's got 15 years of experience working with youth, adults, to prevent sexual assaults, both local, state, and national level. She also was a visiting fellow in the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing and Monitoring, Apprehending, and Registering and Tracking, the SMART office for the U.S. programs in the U.S. Department of Justice. She was also the Executive Director of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So a wealth of experience. And so we'll go ahead and learn from Katie about the Safe Sport law. So Katie, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. And I want to thank everybody on the phone for your commitment to addressing and preventing sexual abuse within adaptive sports. It's really exciting to see everybody connecting over the web chat. So you've heard some great information from Meg and Joe, and there are a lot of resources that are out there to support you and the organization's critical work that you're doing. So what we're going to move into next is really talking about the law. So I'm going to provide an overview of the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act of 2017 and steps that you can take within your organizations. So for those of you that haven't heard of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, we opened our doors in March of 2017. We are 2 years old as a nonprofit national organization, and I will tell you, based on the over 2,000 reports of abuse in sport that survivors have reported to us over the last 2 years, it's very clear that the need is great and that all of us owe it to all athletes to be safe, supported, and strengthened through their sport. And it's through collaborations like these and conversations like Joe was talking about, reaching out around what other policies are out there, that through those collaborations that we can truly prevent this abuse. So as we're thinking about the law and what it means to you, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act of 2017, it's also commonly referred to as a Safe Sport Act. It was created in response to recent revelations of abuse within sport organizations, many of which have been happening for decades. It was signed into law last year on Valentine's Day, and this new federal law has expanded requirements around sexual abuse reporting and also prevention policies, which is key. We love seeing primary prevention and other strategies in there. And it's really about addressing those sport organizations that arrange or sponsor youth sports competitions. So the new requirements affect organizations that arrange interstate or international amateur athletic competitions for minors, and it also impacts the adults that work with those minor amateur athletes on behalf of those organizations. So I want to just make a disclaimer that, this is not legal advice. I'm not an attorney. I know there are lots of legal questions come up when we talk about the Safe Sport Act, and certainly if you have additional questions about the law, I would encourage you to reach out to your organization's counsel or someone on your board of directors that can assist with that. And we can also assist with pointing you in the right direction. So when we think about this law, one thing that it did is it designated the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, which is an independent nonprofit organization, to serve as the national safe sport organization for the United States. We also have authority to exercise jurisdiction over the U.S. Olympic Committee, a separate organization. We have jurisdiction over each of the 50 national sport governing bodies recognized by the U.S. Olympic Committee and each Paralympic sports organization with regard to safeguarding amateur athletes against abuse. And when we're talking about what types of abuse this includes, it includes emotional, physical, and sexual abuse within sports. One of the other things that it did is designate, and we had already set up an Office for Education and Outreach, so that's where I work. We also have Dan Mills, who's, in the chat box. He's also available on the webinar. He's one of our trainers that goes out and provides assistance and training. And within that office, that we have oversight to develop training, policies, practices, and procedures to prevent the abuse in sport. We also have an Office for Response and Resolution, and that office is charged with establishing mechanisms allowing for reporting, investigation, resolution of those cases, and then lastly, ensuring that there are mechanisms that provide fair notice and an opportunity to be heard, and protecting the privacy and safety of complainants, which is critical. So the chart that you see up there on the screen, within the Safe Sport Authorization Act, there's essentially two major sections within the law, and it addresses two different groups. So the first set of requirements focuses on those covered organizations like the 50 sport national governing bodies. You might hear me refer to them as NGBs for short, and those are the sport organizations that are recognized by the U.S. Olympic Committee. So this includes sports like gymnastics, hockey, swimming, and 47 others. Some of the Paralympic sports are recognized under the National Sport Governing Body. So for instance, sitting volleyball, which is the Paralympic sport that's part of USA Volleyball. And then other Paralympic sports may be governed by the U.S. Olympic Committee that acts as the NGB, for instance, like U.S. Paralympics track and field. So for any of those groups, there are many more requirements for those organizations. And for the purposes of today's webinar, I'm really going to focus on the second section within the law, and that's really pertaining to the amateur sport organizations. But certainly if anybody on the phone is in that first category, and if you have questions at the end or after the fact, I'm happy to talk with you later. So that second set of requirements really focuses on those youth-serving amateur sports organizations. I also refer to them as like ASOs. So Senate Bill 534, that federal law, defines an ASO that participates in interstate or international amateur athletic competition, and the membership includes any adult who is in regular contact with an amateur athlete who's a minor. So what does this mean, and what do you need to do? So there's four major requirements that we're going to hit on today. The first one is reporting child abuse. The second one is establishing reasonable procedures to limit one-on-one interactions between an amateur athlete who's a minor and an adult. The third is prohibiting retaliation by that amateur sports organization so that any individual who reports has protections under federal law against retaliation. And then the fourth is offering and providing consistent training. So within that last one, the training umbrellas, that includes providing training to all adult members who are in regular contact with kids who are within that sport organization. And the second is subject to parental consent to members who are minors. And that training needs to be on prevention and reporting of child abuse and allowing a complainant to report easily an incident of child abuse to the appropriate persons.
So Katie, this is Ashley. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just had a clarifying question from Meg. Wondering then, so it has that language around interstate or international, so does that law only apply to athletic organizations that travel across state or national lines, and then it wouldn't apply to organizations that stay local?
So, It totally makes sense. So again, there's two sections of the law. So for national governing bodies and those groups that are under the USOC, those organizations are going to be required to follow all these requirements. For the amateur sport organizations that participate in interstate or international travel, I would recommend that, those organizations consult with their general counsel and check out, within their organization, because oftentimes you're dealing with umbrellas, and so there's lots of nuances with each organization. Does that second piece apply to them or not? But also, I think this law is a really wonderful reminder of the best practices of things that we all should be doing. I think you heard from Meg and from Joe that these 4 things are really things that we all should be doing, and we are seeing this law applied in creating a new standard of care. And so when we're talking about reporting child abuse, providing consistent training, prohibiting retaliation, having policies to prohibit limiting one-on-one interactions, I would encourage every youth-serving organization and organizations working in sports to take a look at this and make sure that you're putting some of these pieces in place.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie.
Yeah. So when we look at the first one in terms of reporting child abuse, so within the law, what this is pertaining to is that all adults authorized by the organization that interact with athletes, so this includes coaches and volunteers, are deemed mandatory reporters of child abuse. So what was really new about this law and important is that, as you all know, we've been working with state-by-state requirements that could vary. In some states, coaches may not have been included as a mandated reporter. And so what this federal law did is say, in these types of organizations, these individuals are also mandated reporters. And so additionally, it includes adult members of a national governing body. So in terms of those reports, you need to report any incidences or suspected incidents of child abuse as soon as possible and in no event later than 24 hours to the appropriate authorities. So for organizations, that means reporting to law enforcement. In some states, that might be child protection services, could be both. And for individuals and local clubs that are part of a national governing body, such as USA Gymnastics, USA Swimming, and others, those mandated reporters are also required under the federal law to report directly to us at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. And we make it really easy for you guys to do that. So on our website at safesport.org, we have an online reporting form. Abuse can be reported anywhere, anytime, and by anyone. We have no statute of limitations in our process, and we encourage people to get this resource out. We will work through figuring out if we have jurisdiction over an individual or not, but this is something that people can also report anonymously as well. The second piece of the law we're going to touch on is limiting one-on-one interactions. So the law also requires establishing reasonable procedures to limit those one-on-one interactions between a minor athlete and an adult. So we know, and Meg talked about this, that the majority of child sexual abuse is perpetrated in isolated one-on-one situations. And by reducing such interactions between kids and adults, you reduce the risk of child sexual abuse. We also know, however, that one-on-one time with trusted adults can be a healthy and valuable tool for the child in terms of positive, appropriate mentorship. So policies concerning one-on-one interactions can protect kids while allowing for these beneficial, appropriate relationships. So there's 2 words that I think are really important to think about, especially when you're talking with boards of directors at your organizations about what policies you put forth. And so the 2 most important words to remember are observable and interruptible. So the law also authorizes the center to develop policies and procedures to implement by those NGBs and Paralympic sports organizations. And we have created some model policies to assist the NGBs and all of you with this. So an example that we have is that one-on-one interactions between minors and adults, and that adult would be not the minor's legal guardian or parent. So those interactions at our facility are permitted if they occur at an observable and interruptible distance by another adult, except under emergency circumstances. And that essentially means if you're in a skating rink, if you're on the gym floor, that someone can see that interaction and someone can interrupt that interaction. And the tools that we have available, and you'll see that, I think, on the website when you registered, is that we published the Minor Athlete Abuse Prevention Policies in January. And so these policies are required to be followed by all 15 NGBs and the USOC. The model policies are also available for you to use. You can modify or adapt it to your sport. Happy to send you a Word document if that's helpful so that you can adapt any of the language to make it more sport-specific based on your needs. And one of the things that the center is going to be doing is conducting regular and random audits of the NGBs and the USOC. This is a requirement also under that federal law. What we're going to be doing is monitoring compliance to make sure that these and other policies are followed. To do that, we're going to be publishing and putting together some tools for audits in the future. Some of this information we're going to make just available to anyone publicly in terms of how you can help audit your organization in terms of following these policies. So that, again, as Meg and Joe talked about, it's not just a one-time thing, but tools to continue to monitor and look at the application and implementation of those policies. I do want to note that the center's policies are the floor, so they're minimum requirements, and we encourage all sport organizations to go above and beyond to keep athletes safe. So the third piece we're going to talk about within the federal law is around prohibiting retaliation, which is incredibly important. So the federal law also requires that organizations have procedures to prohibit retaliation so that any individual who makes a report has those federal protections. And one of the ways that you can do that is make sure that you have a mechanism within your policy to encourage reporting and make sure that they're reporting any retaliation that they may experience to you. So if someone falls under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, we have what's called a Safe Sport Code of Conduct. And so that is used across the entire U.S. Olympic and Paralympic movement. And so, you know, this is a resource you can check out. It has definitions, things that you can use and apply without having to start from scratch. We don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel, and so that's a tool that you can also take a look at. Within the Safe Sport Code, we have those definitions of misconduct. So some of those definitions include criminal offenses as violations, and some are behaviors that are not criminal. And so within our Center for Safe Sport Code of Conduct, we have a policy that prohibits retaliation, and we encourage anyone to report retaliation directly to the center. A resource that we know is incredibly helpful for survivors around the country is having that 24/7 advocacy support. And so in addition to making a formal report of abuse, the center also works with RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, who runs the Safe Sport Helpline. And that's a confidential support line for survivors 24/7. You can access it over the phone or via online chat as well. And then the last piece of the federal law we really want to go into is the consistent training piece, because I know this is something people have a lot of questions about. So under the law, amateur sport organizations that meet that definition need to provide consistent abuse prevention training. So the center's minor athlete abuse prevention policies set training requirements for those NGBs to follow, and we also specify the type of training as well as the frequency of training. One of the things that we require in our policies is that board members of those covered organizations also complete training. Meg talked about this, and I think, you know, that leadership support is critical. Obviously, Joe's leadership is amazing in terms of taking the lead and saying these are things that we value in our organization and we want to address. So kudos to you guys and to everybody on this webinar that's working on those issues. And one of the things I know Joe referenced is different types of training that's available. So one of the requirements for an amateur sport organization, particularly with adults, is those adult members who are in regular contact with amateur athletes who are minors need to provide consistent training and reporting of both on prevention and reporting of child abuse. And so while individuals within the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic movement are required to take the center's 90-minute core training, it's also available for amateur sports organizations and individuals so that you can meet the requirements under S534. That training covers sexual misconduct awareness, emotional and physical misconduct, as well as mandatory reporting. And the training is available at athletesafety.org if you're not part of a national governing body and want to check it out. And in terms of some additional resources and requirements under the law, so that last one was really pertaining to adults who have regular contact with kids. Also under the law and subject to parental consent, the organization needs to offer and provide training annually to members who are minors regarding the prevention of child abuse. So what the center is developing right now are free minor athlete training resources. They're developmentally and age appropriate. They're from preschool all the way through high school age, so they're 5 different age groups. The center is planning to launch those minor athlete training resources within our learning management system over the next couple of months. So those will be free and available. I will make sure Brian has that, and that can be updated on the Sport Plus Prevention Center that they have through Reliance. And then another resource I just want to make you guys aware of is that we offer free parent training at athletesafety.org. And I will tell you, we've heard from parents that, taking training, getting involved, organizations making sure they're messaging to parents about their commitment to prevent abuse can help identify those early signs of grooming and prevent further abuse from being perpetrated, which is why we're all here, is to prevent abuse from happening in the first place. One additional resource we've got online is a parent toolkit, and so this is also broken down to different age groups, and so it covers things like talking tips, how you talk to your child if they're 6 years old or if they're 16, about prevention, how you respond. It also has sample questions on what to ask your child's sport organization, things like, do you require training, and do you have a policy in place to address these issues and keep athletes safe? So I'm going to cover just a couple more resources, and then we're going to open it up for some questions and discussion. And so as Meg talked about, there are lots of different strategies that need to be in place. And Joe talked about this as well. So it's not only about having a policy. It isn't only about doing criminal background checks. To truly create safe sport environments for our athletes, we need to take a comprehensive prevention approach. And this includes things like training, so including mandatory reporting of abuse, making sure it's not just training once and then you're done forever. We know that what works in prevention is that it must be ongoing, and prevention is not just about checking a box. Things like screening. Criminal background checks will only identify individuals with a criminal history. Many perpetrators of abuse do not have a criminal record, so other strategies must be implemented, including solid reference checks and setting expectations with prospective volunteers and employees that in your sport, abuse is not welcome here. Applying the policies by establishing boundaries like limiting one-on-one interactions. Managing training and competition by addressing best practices during team travel, things like having trained chaperones and addressing too-deep leadership. It includes a protocol for responding and policies to prohibit retaliation. And last but not least, monitoring. Are the policies working? Do members know, one, that you have a policy, and do they know what's expected of them? Have we communicated our culture of safety to parents in our community? How do we address accountability in the organization when someone violates the policies and harms someone? And a resource that we have for you is our centralized disciplinary database. So this searchable database is online at safesport.org. It includes all records from the U.S. Center for Safe Sport from March of 2017 when we opened our doors through the present. We have recently also added historical disciplinary records received from and certified by those NGBs for individuals who have been sanctioned and rendered ineligible for sexual misconduct offenses in the past. We're going to continue to update this and add any new as well as historical records that come in. So as you think about your organization, consider those short-term and long-term changes. What action can you take today? Where would you like to see progress in the next year, in 5 years, in 20? We're committed to changing the climate long-term and working to adapt a climate survey in sports, as well as moving the needle with ongoing prevention engagement to organizations like yours and partnering together because we're all committed to those solutions. And lastly, we're working with Dr. Keith Kaufman and then Erin McConnell on our staff on adapting Dr. Kaufman's situational prevention approach to sports. So we're going to be working with various Olympic and Paralympic teams, and we plan to develop additional resources as well as an advisory board over the next several years to increase that capacity for sustainable change. So if anybody's interested in that, definitely reach out to me after the webinar. So we know that ending abuse takes all of us working together, and I really want to thank you for your commitment and leadership to creating safe sport environments to everyone. If there's anything that I or others at the center can assist with, please reach out, and we'd be happy to talk with you more. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
Hey, Katie, just really quick, we did have one question that came out was, Jessica asked, how do I sign up on safesport.org if I am a rape crisis agency and not a sports agency? It asks for a membership.
Sure. So the center does not have membership into our organization. There's membership within each of the governing bodies in terms of, access to training resources. That's why we created athletesafety.org. And so if you want to take some of the additional training resources, you can check that out there. Having come from working in the, sexual assault prevention and advocacy field, working with survivors, happy to talk with any rape crisis centers if there are additional questions that you have if I didn't address that. But if you're looking at getting access to the training, you can go on athletesafety.org.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm really excited about that you're going to be having those trainings coming out, and especially the one for parents. And we will, when we get that, we will load it into the resource center at the Sport Prevention Center on Reliance. So thank you, Katie. We did have a question after that we did want to ask the group and give everybody a second to kind of go over. What will you do to promote athlete safety in your organization, whether it is what you've learned here from our presenters or what it's got you thinking about when you have time afterwards to think about what's going on in your organization? Just what would you do to promote safety in the organization? And then we also did want to make sure that we've got our three presenters here, so we also are looking at the chat if there's some questions that we can to kind of explore further some of the things that came up while you were listening to them, or if you have things that maybe you're already doing that you want some clarification. If we're not looking for anything that's going to be very specific, of course, we're looking for broad things. But if there's things that you're doing in your organization, you kind of ask broadly. We do have an opportunity here to ask some of those questions to our great panel here. Going back to our question before about some of the people who should be at the table, and the question that we asked right after Joe, a couple things that we did see was some people talked about having a committee that they've got their specific leadership in their organization, their legal counsel. People talked about having victims be a part of the discussion, and also just making sure that you have that athlete voice. Another thing that was pointed out by Dan. Okay. See if any of you give a couple more seconds here, see if people have some questions. And then I'll ask our panel too, guys, is there anything after listening to each other, any clarification or questions that have come up for you or things that you can think of? We also have time for that too.
Just thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see, someone's typing something, so we'll see. We have something here. Yeah, this is really great to, I think it's really great to, after Meg, just great going through your explanation. I think especially with sharing just your experience, I think it's something that all of us have had about when something happens. We always hope we'll do the right thing, but hearing your example was really powerful, I think, is how it drives you in the work that you're doing. And Joe, thank you for sharing how you all came to put your policy together. I think that's incredibly valuable in sharing the policy. And then Katie, the explanation of the safe sport law, I think is something that people will, whether they ask it here, they will have questions, I'm sure, and to know that they can always reach out to you. Okay, we'll spend a little bit more time here and see if anyone else has anything. Okay. Well, I do want to say thank you for everyone for joining. We really do thank you for the work that you're doing, and the fact that you are here trying to find ways not just to keep athletes safe, but also, working in this. What we're doing is we are really trying to make sure that we end sexual violence, and sport affects so many people, whether it is the athletes that we're working with. Those athletes go on and become fathers, they become coaches themselves, they become mothers and coaches themselves, but also just the people who also participate, who support athletics, who are fans. The work that you do influences so many people, and so we do see that sport is key in helping us in this. And so Let me just say thank all of you for being here and the work that you're doing. We have the contact information up here for our presenters, and you can also contact me if you have questions or if you're that I can help you with the Sport Prevention Center, or if you do have programs or things that you would like to add to our resource center. We'd love to hear from you. But we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much. And as you can see, if you do need to reach out, please feel free to reach out, and we're very thankful for your attending and participating in our webcast.
Thanks, Brian. So I just want to, as everyone has already done, thank you all for joining us. This web conference was recorded and should be available within about a week or so. We'll also send an email when that is available so you know that it's there. And just one last thanks to Megan for, I kind of think this sums up this conversation really well, that even if you're not working in a sport or specifically like a sport organization, but you have athletics programs, how do you need to consider policies that are specific to athletics and to sport? So thanks, Megan, for that last comment there. Thank you all again. Thanks to our wonderful guests. Thank you, Brian. Again, if you all need anything, feel free to reach out to Prevent Connect. We will be sending you a link to a brief survey in the next couple of minutes. And at the end of that survey, there is an opportunity for you to download a certificate of attendance. So thank you all so much again. This concludes our web conference for today, and we hope to interact with you on a future web conference. Take care.